17.5 million pounds. That's what a single medieval castle costs when you adjust for inflation. Not a palace, not a cathedral. One fortress, on one rocky outcrop, in one corner of Wales. And it wasn't even unfinished. The year is 1283, and King Edward I of England has a problem. He has just conquered Wales, but holding it is another matter entirely. The Welsh are not going quietly. So Edward does what powerful men have always done when they want to send an unmistakable message. He builds, not one castle, not two. An entire ring of stone fortresses stretches across North Wales, each one designed to be larger, stronger, and more terrifying than anything the Welsh have ever seen. But here's what nobody talks about when they admire those beautiful ruins. The money. The absolutely obscene, kingdom-wrecking amount of money it took to pull this off. Take Caernarfon, Edward's crown jewel. Construction began in 1283, and by the time workers finally put down their tools in 1330, the bill had climbed past £20,000. Sounds modest until you realize the entire English Treasury brought in less than £20,000 a year. Edward literally spent more on one castle than his kingdom earned in a full 12 months. Caernarfon was just one piece of the puzzle. Across all his Welsh castles, Edward burned through £80,000, which is 56 million in today's money. The expense was so catastrophic, he had to borrow from Italian banking families just to keep the operation running. But why? Why did a pile of stone cost more than a king's annual income? 2 words: human labor. 83% of a castle's total cost went straight into paying workers. And we are not talking about a small crew. At Harlech Castle during the summer of 1286, the construction site looked like a small city. 546 laborers hauling materials, 115 quarrymen splitting rock, 227 stonemasons carving and fitting each block by hand, 22 carpenters building scaffolding, forms, and roof frames, 30 blacksmiths forging every single nail, clamp, and chisel the site needed. That is nearly 1,000 men working simultaneously on one fortress. A master mason, the most skilled person on any medieval construction site, earned 4 pence a day. A common laborer got 1 or 2. It does not sound like much until you multiply it by hundreds of workers, every day, for years, sometimes decades. The payroll alone was enough to drain a lord's treasury dry. And labor was only part of the nightmare. Materials had to come from somewhere, and getting them to the building site could cost more than the materials themselves. Records from Caernarfon tell a remarkable story. The raw stone and timber cost £150. Transporting it cost £535. That was more than 3 times the price of the actual material. Every block of limestone had to be quarried, shaped at the source, loaded onto carts or barges, and hauled to the construction site. The walls at Caernarfon were 6 meters thick in places. That's nearly 20 feet of solid stone, and every inch of it arrived on the backs of men and oxen. Now think about what this meant for a smaller lord, someone without the resources of a king. A town of 2,000 people in medieval Germany would have needed to commit half its entire annual budget every year for 2 solid years just to build a modest tower house, not a full castle with curtain walls, a keep, and a gatehouse. A tower. That is the economic reality lurking behind every romantic ruin you have ever visited. Castles were not just military structures. They were financial sinkholes that could devour the wealth of entire communities for a generation. Richard the Lionheart understood this better than anyone, and he leaned into it. In 1196, he began building Château Gaillard in Normandy, a fortress so advanced it used innovations that would not become standard for another century. He finished it in 2 years, which was almost unheard of, pouring £12,000 into the project. For context, Richard spent just £7,000 on every castle in England during his entire reign combined. One fortress in France cost him nearly double what he spent on an entire country's worth of castles. When the French King Philip scoffed that the walls would never hold, Richard shot back that he could defend it even if the walls were made of butter. It was a flex, but it was also a statement about how much money and engineering genius he had poured into those stones. And if you think this sounds excessive for the medieval world, there is a project running right now that proves just how insane castle construction really was. In 1997, a team in Burgundy, France started building Guédelon Castle entirely from scratch. No power tools, no machinery, no modern materials, just medieval methods, medieval tools, and 40 full-time builders doing everything by hand. They quarry their own stone. They forge their own nails. They mix mortar from lime and sand exactly the way it was done 800 years ago. 28 years later, the castle is still not done. 300,000 tourists visit every year. The project generates €3 million in annual revenue. Still, the walls rise slowly, stone by stone, because that is the brutal truth of medieval construction. There are no shortcuts when every block has to be split from bedrock with a hammer and chisel, shaped by hand, carried by cart, and lifted into place with a wooden crane powered by men walking inside a giant wheel. That is the real cost of a medieval castle. Not just gold, but years. Lifetimes. Entire generations of labor poured into stone that was never guaranteed to stand. Edward's Beaumaris Castle hit £15,000 and was still only 2/3 complete when the money finally ran out. They just stopped, walked away. Left a masterpiece of military architecture permanently unfinished because the King's Wars in Scotland had swallowed every last coin. Next time you see a castle ruin with its crumbling towers and empty windows, remember that someone once stared at a bill large enough to bankrupt a kingdom and said yes. Build it anyway.